Hello and welcome to the Leaders in Supply Chain podcast. I am your host, Radu Palamariu, Managing Director of Elcott Global. Our mission is to connect the supply chain ecosystem by bringing forward the most interesting leaders in the industry. And it's my pleasure to have with us today Marc Dragon, Managing Director of Reefknot Ventures. Reefknot Ventures is a joint partnership between Temasek, which is Singapore's state-owned fund, and the global logistics company Kuehne Nagel. The firm is based in Singapore, but is looking for companies around the world that are raising their Series A or B rounds, with a focus on high-growth technology companies pushing new frontiers within the supply chain and logistics space. Marc has more than 20 years in the ICT and management consulting industry in Asia, mostly focused on the areas of analytics, IT, and supply chain solutions. He started his career in Deloitte and IBM for many years, and then transitioned in several roles in venture capital, entrepreneurial setups, and he's also very actively involved in the startup community in ASEAN and Asia in general, being a mentor and advisor to different startups. He took over Reefknot about a year ago with a vision to build a global ecosystem of high-value partners who will bring added support to help accelerate startups in tech, logistics, and supply chain. Marc, thanks for making the time. A pleasure to have you with us today.
Thanks, Radu, and thank you for having me in this podcast.
And maybe let's start by asking you to tell us a bit about yourself. What drove you in your career to switch from doing consulting to being very actively involved in VC and startup world?
Yeah, thanks, and also thanks for the introduction about 20 plus years in industry, right? And starting at
Sorry
IBM.
to make you sound old.
No, that's not that old compared to the whole industry. When I first started out in IBM in technology, these are the big MNCs, right? So started on a very big MNC perspective, and even in Deloitte as well. I was consulting for clients across the region as well. And as I looked out into the space, I found that there were a lot of, even about 10 years ago, right, there were startups that were starting to challenge the norm, in the supply chain, logistics, and technology industry. And this was way back 10 years ago, before the term big data actually came out. So I sort of sensed that kind of, that change, and I felt that I wanted to do something impactful other than being in a large company and running a business unit within a large organization. And that's why I came out to do my startups, right? And it's only when you do your own startup, then you realize the pain and the difficulty that a startup would face, right? Everything from, fundraising, cash flow, hiring folks, getting projects, delivering projects and stuff like that. So it was a interesting yet painful process, right? For the first couple of years when I did my first startup in the big data space. When I did my second one, we applied a lot of learnings, co-founded this analytics startup, and we grew it quite large, and it was acquired, a majority acquired by Goldman, right? After that, after doing that whole big multinational thing, and doing that startup from scratch to a certain size, there was a gap that I felt that I had that I wanted to, scratch, which was really bringing a company to IPO, right? So, and therefore, I had the opportunity to lead, an Asia Pacific supply chain technology firm as a CEO for a few years. And subsequently, when this opportunity came out, to really be much more involved in a global startup space, I jumped on it, right? So long story short, why the switch from a large company into this VC space, is really, I saw the impact early on of new business models and technologies, right? And I really wanted to be, a key player to help the transformation of the industry. Initially in the small little space that I was in ASEAN and Asia Pacific, and now I have the opportunity to do it globally.
Mm-hmm. And Reefknot is a fairly unique setup because it's a partnership between a state-owned fund, which is Temasek, and a private logistics company, which is Kuehne Nagel, one of the largest in the world. How did that happen? How did this partnership came about?
Well, firstly, Temasek, with more than 200 billion worth of AUM, it's an investment firm, it's an investment fund by itself, right? So they're driven by their own, measurements, right? And KN being squarely in the supply chain logistics, a key leader of this globally, right? The whole industry is basically looking at transformations in the industry. They're looking at business models that's coming out, right? They're looking at new technologies. How can it be applied, right? And I think it's just, I can't talk about how they got together, but ultimately the fund itself, is really looking at early stage business models and technologies, right, that would transform the industry, right? And I think as part of this roadmap, and just bearing in mind, we are not a CVC, right? We are a pure venture capital firm. We're driven primarily by returns, right? But the other key metrics that we look at is really, the ability to support startups that transform the industry. And that's very, very key, right? It needs to be transformative. It needs to be differentiated, right? If a startup comes up, it potentially is great returns, but it is similar to a lot of the others out there, we are likely going to pass that, right? Also, another thing I want to bring up around, why the industry, and how we are looking at it, right? So the supply chain logistics industry is really facing multi-pronged pressures, right? That's creating huge opportunities for new business models and technologies, right? And it's not only a case where startups come up, disrupt the industry, and kill the incumbents or traditional folks. It's not that case, right? It is a case where, and now we're starting to see it, right? Where is there really value add that's created with these business models and these technologies? Or is it, and this value add, is it an incremental value add, productivity improvement, operational improvement, or is it really changing fundamentally how the industry works in some certain areas, right? And I think that is really what we are focused on, right? And to be very clear about investment thesis in those specific areas. Is it purely for operational improvements and productivity gains, right? And if so, is incremental improvements? Or is it more a case of really transformative and things are happening that hasn't happened before and the opportunities are there? So I think, with us focused on this place, I think the hope is that we can help our ecosystem partners and especially our LPs, right, to identify more of these very niche opportunities that's coming out.
I was reading on your website that even more focused and more specifically, you have three main areas of interest, which are artificial intelligence, you have digital logistics as the second one, and as the third one, you have trade finance. Yeah. And I was actually curious why these three. I mean, an obvious buzzword that missing is blockchain, or we can throw others, automation or whatever. So why did you pick these three?
Yeah. A lot of buzzwords out there, right? There's blockchain, even IoT, 5G, autonomous. There's a whole
drones,
drones. Correct, right? So there's a whole bunch of buzzwords being thrown out there. A lot of those buzzwords are they can be deemed as fundamental technologies or platforms to enable certain stuff, right? Would one technology be differentiated than the other and things like that? That's one part of it, right? So we are not that kind of a VC firm where we will go so deep into, like, say, autonomous vehicles and lidars and stuff like that. We might look at it, right? But it enables it requires a different type of deep tech, perhaps longer term kind of VCs to look at it. Now, for us, we look at it more from a solution clustering perspective, right? And we think about, what are areas that are broad enough categories to be able to, because industry changes, but yet some things stay the same, right? So broad enough categories for us to be able to capture some of the stuff that's changing and yet be able to zoom down and focus on some areas that the industry understands as terminologies. That's the first point. The second one is really, how are these areas need to be able to support new differentiated technologies and models, right? So, it is not so much of broad, general statements, but more specific ones, right? So even if you say things like AI, we will still go at least a few levels lower to say what kind of AI, right? Okay, so I'll talk more about that solution area a bit later. And the third reason of choosing these spaces is that, it allows us to be able to focus and yet evolve the thinking on a daily basis, right? So AI evolves. Traditionally, in the supply chain logistics world, AI was equivalent to operations research, right? OR, demand forecasting, right? And there are very traditional techniques in those areas, right? But why we actually put AI into this bucket was because we felt that this area was ripe for change with new technologies coming out, right? That's one. And in the digital logistics space, it's enough said, right? There's a lot of models that's coming out, and these might purely be business models, right? Or it might be technologies that enables business models. Our interest is more in the technologies that enables the business models rather than the business models by itself, right? And the reason is this, right? The core technologies or IP is actually the one that would drive differentiation and sustainability of the business model into the future. It's not the general business operating model itself, right? General operating models can be copied, but if you have a core IP there that holds everything together, that can't be so readily copied. So that core IP is the one we're really looking for, right? Sometimes the core IP might be in the context of, an enterprise software even, right? That looks at specifically data, either collection of data or even, creation of new data, right? So that in combination with enterprise software is something that we're looking at, right? Things like, core analytics or predictive models around enterprise software, right? And the kind of data that they collect is also another model they're looking at in the digital logistics.
If I am to kind of try to comprehend this in my own lens in a very simplistic example, let's say I have 100 trucks and my competitor has 100 trucks. So, 10 other competitors can buy 100 trucks. But what you're after is that maybe, as an example, that the software that optimizes the deliveries, optimizes the routes, that will basically make that particular trucking company way better than all the rest because they wouldn't have the same software to just as an example, the software. Something like that?
I would take it a few levels more than that, right? I would take it as not so much optimization because there's a lot of capabilities out there capabilities to optimize routes, for example. But, if there is some specific IP around where demand is really coming from, right? Ability to predict prices along certain lanes, right? Ability to predict capacity around certain lanes, right? And then everything else sort of falls in order, right? If you know your demand, your capacity, then the optimization happens,
Yes.
right? The backhaul, optimizing backhaul and the whole capacity utilization, that kind of a thing. And so that is the core piece that we're looking at, right?
Actually, you mentioned that you're not looking into optimizations. Yeah, I chose the wrong example. Yeah. It's much more clear now.
Yes. So we're looking for that secret sauce, right? Other than a general capability. So that's on the digital logistics space. Now, of course, trade finance. We feel that trade finance is really an area where there's some solutions and capabilities that have, I mentioned before, provide incremental changes, right? Trade finance is potentially an area that that is ripe for revolutionary change, with its relation to supply chain and logistics, right? And the reason for this is this. With greater visibility of data, right, and the trust in the data that's coming out, right, we envision there'll be new business models and capabilities and financing opportunities around financing for various players in the chain, not only the chain master and the first tier suppliers, but all through the second, third tier suppliers and deep tier guys, that were previously underserved, right, by the traditional financing organizations, right? And new business models will start emerging out of trade finance as well. It's not only in terms of as consumers, for example, we are faced with many options, right? When it comes to e-commerce, right? Do you want to buy a product, you order, and sometimes there might be an option of a long-term payment plan, a 1 year, that kind of a thing with certain interest rate. Why can't that be the same for every other enterprise out there, right? Yes, I'll accept this, and and for this particular transaction, I'm willing to get a discounted rate out of it and take the money now, that kind of a thing. And you don't necessarily need to do deep KYC with me previously, right? But the data is available outside everywhere else to ascertain that I'm actually good for that particular order, right? So trade finance, we feel, is going to be, over the next couple of years, it will be a revolutionary change, with regards to supply chain logistics, and especially the supply chain logistics data that's coming out.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. Yeah. And I wanted to actually drill in the first investment that you have done, right, which is in an AI startup called Prowler.io, which is an AI platform for decision making. I think it's called Vuku. And in long story short, they make organizations or they help organizations make better decisions in financial markets, in logistics, in ride sharing, smart cities, and robotics. So I think the round was about 24 million, Series B, and you contributed, but also your ecosystem partners contributed to it, which was the Singapore Government Innovation Platform, SG Innovate. I think you had Atlantic Bridge, RB Capital, Tencent Holdings, and some other participated. So maybe tell us how and why did you choose this particular startup, and a little bit the story around it.
Oh wow. I think I'll go back a little bit to operations research, right, and the whole traditional way of industry looking at it. And this was several years back. So several years back, when I was leading that regional supply chain technology firm, I was not convinced that, the traditional ways of, optimization was optimal, right? In the first place, the ability to do multi-mode, multi-node, multi-tier, optimization was really not there, right? And part of it was, yes, data and stuff, but also part of it was the math and the technologies to be able to do that. The moment you hit, X amount of nodes, or the sort of solution sort of breaks down, right? So I was actively on the lookout for someone, but and generally there was some new, I won't say new, but there's new thinking around different models that sort of came up, but wasn't really applied in industry. Those are just math models in universities and stuff like that. So that was several years back. So when I was introduced to Prowler, right, early this year, you know, I was quite excited because they showed, you know, that by using their deep AI probabilistic model, you know, with reinforcement learning capabilities, you know, they were able to, with less data, have better results than the traditional methods, right? And they've proven this in POCs with some large clients, you know, that they will give like more than 20% accuracy rate compared to how a traditional optimization and forecasting solution would do, right? So, you know, with that, you know, and that was because the core models are different, right? So with that, you know, we found that, I was excited to be able to find them and glad an opportunity to be able to co-invest in this. Because nowadays, for very good startups, it's not a case of, you know, them necessarily looking out for investors per se, but more a case of them choosing which investors they will allow, you know, to be part of their of their ecosystem in the company, right? So it's the other way around, especially for the good ones. Yeah. Yeah, so we are actually very optimistic that, you know, with their new techniques, it can be quite revolutionary for the industry. And especially now, where, especially in a macroeconomic environment, there's so much dynamic stuff happening, right? How do companies react to it and stuff like that? And that's exactly where their models come in, because you might not have data around the new stuff that's happening, right? But you still need a result, and you still need to be dynamic, and that's where they come in to help those planning and allocations and pricing decisions.
And I guess a key question that would be on the minds of a lot of our listeners would be, how do you decide which startup to invest? Okay, in this case, we speak specifically about this one, but, and you know, there's tens, hundreds, thousands of startups that you pass on, right? So what's that crux? What's the gist of that? How do you make that decision?
We haven't reached the thousands of startups that we passed on, but I can say it's hundreds.
In 1 year. So
in 1 year, correct, exactly, right? I think the number one key criteria is really the investment returns. That's straightforward, right? And that's relatively straightforward to the other two things, right? The second is, you know, it needs to potentially have a capability, be it IP or technology, to potentially be transformative for the industry. So that is a big word, and we spent in Reefknot, we spent a lot of time thinking through about business models and how, you know, those solution areas, how is it changing? How is the industry changing within those solution areas that we're focused on? And how certain startups, you know, can potentially, with their capabilities, transform that small little solution area that we're looking at, right? So transformative is very important for us, right? And the third area is a bit more, it sort of shows our propensity to be a bit more active in our investments, right? Which is the ability to actively support them to grow, right? So we are not one of those investors, you know, for better or for worse. We're not one of those investors that, you know, we'll just invest, you know, we get part of the company and we'll sit back and relax and let them run. We are not, right? Going back to the vision of us supporting companies and helping them grow and helping the industry to transform, right? We would like to actively support these startups to transform the industry and to grow. So what you see is that, you know, I've other initiatives that might sound ancillary to this, but, you know, bringing ecosystem partners together, you know, thinking about certain spaces within supply chain and logistics, right? All that actually comes together during an investment. So when we invest in a company, generally, like the Prowler example, for example, right? We would expose them to our industry ecosystem partners if it makes sense, if there's value contribution, right? And these ecosystem partners can be shippers, consumer goods companies, or it can be, other investors, or even individuals, right, that might have strong capabilities to support those startups, right? In some cases, it might be a case where, if the startup would like to expand into a region and they need, to have very strong individuals, right? Then we would bring our ecosystem partners to help to support them in those growth as well. Yeah.
In terms of the startups that you see, and in terms of the common mistakes that you see, especially, I'm guessing again, so hundreds of people have pitched to you. Do you see certain mistakes that they make in even, maybe it can be business models, it can be the way they structure it, it can be the way they pitch. I think that can be relevant also, both for startups as well as for corporates that are listening to this.
Yeah. I think I wouldn't really call it mistakes, right? I'll answer in a different way, right? I'll answer in terms of, what we are looking out for, right? And whether or not we invest or whether or not we like it, this is what we typically are looking out for, right? Number one, to be clear about your proposition and differentiation, right? So some startups, generally, they might be very tech heavy, but really what is it that your customers are looking for? What kind of problems are you solving? How are you different? How is your technology different from the next guy out there? Or is it the same? And if so, enough said, this is end of story, right? So that's number one, be very clear about the proposition differentiation. Number two, I think there's a need for startups, and maybe even extend to corporates as well, to be very self-critical about the defensibility and the strength of your solution and your proposition versus other incumbents and the new competition that's coming out. This area is very, very key, right? It is one of those things where, it's a know yourself type of a thing, and really know yourself, right? And who are your competitors, right? Do you need to change your proposition? Do you need to change your technology or business model or pivot, right? And there's a need for something like a sense and respond, right? Which is my third point, right? So which is always sense and respond and enhance, on a daily basis, right? From your discussions with, if you're a startup, discussions with clients, there's always new learnings coming in. How can you enhance your business model, your technology, your go-to-market based on those individual learnings, right? That's the sense and respond piece, and always enhance, right? So those three pieces, I think, if the startups are very clear and, and clear about their proposition, differentiation, self-critical, and being able to sense and respond and enhance, I think that is something that, is part of what we're looking for, right? Because we might like a startup at that point in time, but we must also be comfortable that 1 year down the road, even with new competition coming, they can still be competitive. Yeah. So those are the kind of three elements that I propose they look at. Yeah.
What would you say that your vision for Reefknot is 5 years down the line, in terms of, how will Reefknot and I think what is an important piece of this question, and the Reefknot ecosystem look like in 5 years' time?
Okay. So, a good point that you brought up, the ecosystem as well. In this space, on a global basis, when I say space, means supply chain, logistics, technology, VC firms, there's basically a handful, right? And on a global basis. So basically very, very few, right? But we're very focused, right? And for Reefknot, in 5 years, I would like us to be the very clear global leader, right? In number one, identifying, and number two, catalyzing, the next generation supply chain technology leaders. Right? We will not spread, as in the sense that we don't intend to invest in many companies, but we intend to invest in a few. But the few that we invest in, we are looking for them to be really the sector leaders, the solution leaders, right? So that's very clear. So for us to be globally recognized as a leader in growing and helping and identifying these companies, right? And the ecosystem that you mentioned, right? The vision is that with the ecosystem partners, this whole Reefknot and the ecosystem will come out as almost like a global leading think tank type of a thing. We think about new areas and solutions and opportunities within supply chain logistics, be it business models, technologies, or whatever have you. We spot them early, and we support these areas of growth, right? So I think that is the kind of vision that I'm looking for Reefknot and our partners over the next 5 years.
Moving it to the talent and human resources side, and which is such an important topic in general for companies, but maybe even more so for startups. And you've had your own startup, you've led companies. Now you're from an investing perspective, obviously you have to look at companies and how they attract talent. What would you say are some of the key factors when it comes to finding and attracting and retaining top talent in a startup environment?
So I think attracting talent to startups now is probably slightly easier than it was, maybe 10 years ago, right? 10 years ago, it was still very much of needing stability and that kind of a thing, right? That big corporates provide. Now, startups tend to have a bit more, there's a lot of excitement, there's an opportunity to grow, right? Both personally and potentially from a wealth perspective, if you become a unicorn. So, there's certain attractiveness inherently into startups for certain individuals. I think that's the first point. Second point is around problems, right? So challenging part. There's generally scarce talent everywhere, from sales to leaders to whatever. But there's two areas that I feel that there's a particular shortage in, right? Data scientists is the obvious one, right? And specifically around data scientists that are familiar with the supply chain logistics problems, right? That's number one. Number two, it's actually good product leaders, right? Product development folks, of leaders that can think around, what is the product or the solution that they are building that's relevant for the market, the differentiation part of it and the pricing part of it, all goes into it, right? But that product piece, I think, is very, very, very key, because, and that differentiates, a services firm from a products firm, and that also differentiates a successful, startup with a good ARR and backlog versus one that is always chasing for the next deal, right? So I think these two are the two key ones that a lot of startups actually I feel face challenges hiring, right? And the third area, it's around actually location, because where the talent resides might not necessarily be where the markets are. So the startups will need to be very, careful to manage, their resources, especially since it's a very scarce resource, right? And across, getting the right talents from the right places and addressing the markets that their products best fit. So I think those couple of challenging areas that the startups will tend to face and will need to address. Yeah.
I'll pick up, all of them are extremely relevant. I'll pick up on the point with the data scientists and the product leaders, because we are currently in the process of figuring out a few searches exactly for that, and I can attest and confirm it's the most in demand skill sets across. Actually, it would be across anything to do with. I would say data scientists are probably in demand in any industry, because pretty much data will drive any industry anyways.
Yeah.
And is driving at the moment, and for the future. Whereas the product, definitely anything to do with tech, they need a good product or good product people, and that product people are so scarce because it's a combination of actually a lot of common sense, and fundamentally it's common sense and ability to put yourself in the shoes of the client and understand, okay, yes, I have this product, but then I need to constantly refine, adjust to the realities of my customer, and that customer will be different depending on the market.
Yes.
So the more markets, the more the more customization of the product. And everybody needs them. Everybody wants them. It's like, it's that kind of rare commodity. I mean, it's not a commodity, it's a human being after all, but it's incredible.
And this is an area that is not well understood by folks that haven't experienced it before, right? So I came from IBM environment, right? It's a very very product centric environment. Yes, there's services, but there's also global product leaders, and there's very clear demarcation and line in terms of what their roles and responsibilities are. So that's one extreme, right? The other extreme, is really startups just building stuff for what their clients are asking for, right? So, as startups grow, they'll need to be able to sense and respond again, going back to the sensing of what the customers are asking for, to actually where their vision of what they want to build and stuff like that. So, that kind of, I think you mentioned common sense, but I think it's way more in common sense, right? There needs to be a very good thinking around, how do you productize? What's the roadmap for it? What's the strategy for it? Besides building the stuff, and not a lot of people understand that.
It's an art. It's an art.
Yeah, correct. It's an art. Yes.
I remember when we have this role as a chief product officer, and always in terms of finding the right fit, we tend to ask also the client, how in your past when you hired somebody like this, how did it go, and what was successful? And then the answer that we got was, well, actually, if I am to think in my history, and it was somebody that had been around for a while at an executive CEO level, and he's like, in my history, the best that I hired was actually not a product person. It had come from operations, had done a bunch of things, studied psychology, understood people really well, had done P&L roles, had done a bit of product, but then, all these things together made her an incredibly good and talented product person. So it's really an art on the product side. On the data science side, it's in some ways much more surgical, because you kind of can track people, but the product is a bit more of an art. So interesting sharing. Final question from me: if you were to give an advice to people listening, looking back at your career, looking back at what you've done, what would you say was some of the most successful or useful pieces of advice that you've gotten that have helped you the most?
Yeah, so not so easy to answer. Maybe I would, I think it's a combination of a few things, right? But first and foremost, and central to it all, is actually following your passion. So following a passion, it might sound like a generic statement, but I think you need to wrap around a few things around it, right? So number one was just, be real about it, right? Can your passion make money? You need to survive, so can it make money, right? How good are you versus the next other guy? Right, that kind of a thing, and going back to sense and respond, you have to apply back to your individual self as well, right? Really knowing yourself, and also part of it is to be aware of the individual role, your individual role in the grand scheme of things, and that might change from time to time. So, for example, I was fortunate enough I'm passionate in the whole supply chain and technology space. It's a space I've been in for a very long time, and because of that passion, folks that are passionate about this in the industry, we know, right? And you can see it, right? And these folks, constantly read stuff, what's happening on a day-to-day basis, and to think about it on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis. That is not possible without passion, right? So with passion, that becomes a central part of it. But really around it, you need to then think about, okay, where's my place in the world? Can I influence my small little part of it, right? And if given other opportunities, maybe I can influence a bigger part of it. But again, going back, I think central point is, follow your passion, right? And build your capabilities around your passion and build your ecosystem around your passion. And with like-minded people, it would just be a very positive kind of cycle, and just get better and better and better. Yeah.
Mm. Marc, thank you so much. Appreciate the time. Good luck in the journey with Reefknot. I would encourage anybody listening that is interested and curious to look you up, to look up Reefknot, to pitch Marc maybe on LinkedIn. See, first listen to the podcast carefully, then pitch Marc. And yeah, good luck in all that you want to do at Reefknot.
Thank you very much, Radu, and thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. If you liked what you heard, be sure to go to www.elcotglobal.com and click the podcast button for all the show notes of the interview. Also, subscribe to our mailing list to get our latest updates first. If you're listening through a streaming platform like iTunes, Spotify, or Stitcher, we would appreciate a kind review. 5-star works best to keep us going and our production team happy. And of course, share it with your friends. I'm most active on LinkedIn, so do feel free to follow me. And if you have any suggestions on what to do and who to invite next, don't hesitate to drop me a note. And if you're looking to hire top executives in supply chain or transform your business, of course, contact us as well to find out how we can help.